We have Gary York, who is a former corrections officer as well as a probation officer. He's written a couple of books. One is entitled Corruption Behind Bars. The other one is Inside the Inner Circle. And then we have a psychotherapist that's going to join by the name of George Mallinckrodt. And George he's worked in the Corrections Institute in Dade County. And so he's going to give us some insight as to, how the conditions and things that can happen in prison. And we all know that there's a lot of bad things that can happen. We're going to share a couple of articles when we come back. This is A Just Cause Coast to Coast, where we bring you education, awareness, and information about judicial injustice. I'm Sam Thurman, along with Cliff Stewart. So let's go to our first guest. Joining us this evening is Mr. Gary York. Mr. York is previously a staff sergeant from the U.S. military, but then after getting out of the military, he went into the Department of Corrections, became a corrections officer, probation officer, senior probation officer. He's been in law enforcement for a long time, got a couple of awards. And here's the thing that's really the kicker. Mr. York has written a couple of books. Mm-hmm. Corruption Behind Bars is one, and then he wrote another book entitled Inside the Inner Circle. Mr. York, how you doing this evening, sir?
Yes, sir. As I heard you say, I was in the military for 8 years, and when I got out of the military, I went into corrections and started out as a correctional officer and worked my way up over the years. And then I ended up doing my last 12 years in corrections in Florida Department of Corrections as a prison inspector, conducting civil, criminal, and administrative investigations within the prison. Basically, I was in internal affairs for the Florida Department of Corrections.
So they didn't like to see you coming.
Well, I've always said, it's funny, the honest officers never had a problem with me showing up at any prison compound. They would talk to me. It was always the officers that shied away and didn't like me, and I learned later why they shied away and didn't like me. It was, if you're on the wrong side of the fence, you tend to not want to be around a prison inspector.
Absolutely. And looking at, we had a short write-up of your bio from Olivia, and she wrote in here that you conducted hundreds of investigations in the prison system regarding numerous crimes that occur in our prison system, cases that are not known to the public but are public record. And
yes,
one of our mantra, everybody who's listened to our show, is that we bring education, awareness, and information about judicial injustice. And I think that that the work that you do really outlines is like, hey, we have a prison system. Is it necessary? Absolutely. Are there men there that deserve to be punished for their crimes? Absolutely. Do we go outside the bounds of those of what those punishments should be? Yes. Are there innocent people in there that should not be, who are now exposed to, like you say, the corrupt prison staff that basically take out their wrath, their fury, their whatever on everybody there, no matter, how small their crime, or if they're there for a time that's extended that shouldn't be, or if they're there for absolutely no reason at all, and they're fighting their conviction because they are actually innocent. And we've had a few people on the show that basically have iterated to us that the prison guards basically become not law enforcement, but they become your judge in prison, because they're the ones who are determining the way that you spend time in prison. They're the ones who are determining if you're being put in solitary confinement, if you're being shackled, if you're being, like the one story that we're going to deal with later with Darren Rainey, if you're putting in a boiling hot shower for 2 hours. They're the ones who become not just law enforcement to ensure that the rules of the prison are enforced, but they become your judge and your executioner right there in prison.
Yes, sir, and I agree 100% with you, and I've kind of come to my own little conclusion. I call the corrupt officers, and we have a lot of good, honest officers out there, just as you said. Yeah. However, I always call the corrupt officers the third society. We have the people that are free and live free, and then we have the people who are incarcerated and live in prison. But then we have that third society who choose to be the corrupt staff members. And they not only hinder the honest officers and cause problems for them, but they take the position of being God and judge, and they decide, as you just said, what the inmate's punishment should be. And they are not there to punish the inmates. They are there to give care, custody, and control, and make sure the inmates are protected from each other and from corrupt officers.
Mr. York, question for you. The fact that we even have to use the term honest officer and corrupt officer, that is a problem. I mean, from the standpoint that how do we get there? I mean, obviously there's some folks with some serious egos, and like you said, there's this third society, and they think that the whole world revolves around them. But I look at the situation of the IRP-6. And I don't know if you know about the case or not, but here you have a situation of 6 gentlemen who are in federal prison, and we're fighting for their exoneration because we know that they're innocent. But we do see cases every week where people have been incarcerated, wrongly incarcerated, for 10, 15, 20 years, yet they have more than likely been subjected to poor conditions, abuse, and everything else that falls under that category by these folks who are, quote, members of the third society. Shouldn't there be a balance there as far as respect? I mean, at least don't disrespect a person. A person shouldn't be disrespected at all, but when it seems as though there's this attempt to just totally take all of their dignity, all of their manhood, shouldn't there be a balance there somehow?
Yes, there should be a balance, and I'm going to tell you my experience from investigating a death of an inmate at Charlotte Correctional Institution who was beaten over a 5-day period, stripped naked, his food thrown on the floor. He was told to bow down when they came to the cell, and when he bowed down, they threw his food tray right on the floor, told him to eat it. When he didn't eat it all, they would go in and beat him. On the 5th day, they strapped him down naked to a metal bunk, and they had taken turns beating him so much he died. And when I got to the crime scene, here's an inmate totally naked, bruised from head to toe with blood on his body, and he's deceased. So you know that he did not kill himself, and we ended up indicting 10 staff members, and we went to federal court in Fort Myers. But what happens is I blame a lot of it on supervision, because if the supervisors were getting up out of their office and doing their job, they could prevent a lot of this. But however, in this case I just told you about, unfortunately, the 2 captains were involved in it, and they got indicted also, so that made it kind of tough on the folks that did not want to be involved in this.
Wow. And, when we come back from this break, we're going to have to take a quick break. But when we come back from this break, I'm going to pose a question to you. I want you to think about it. And when we come back, if you can speak to it. In the same situation with the IRP-6, they're at Florence Federal Correction Facility in Florence, Colorado.
Yes.
On that compound, you have maximum security, super max, medium security, and then what is supposed to be classified as a prison camp. Now, they have this rotating schedule where corrections officers rotate from one facility to the other. Now, the observation is, and we go visit the guys all the time, the observation is that the guys who could be working as a corrections officer in Supermax today, and tomorrow he's over at the camp.
Right.
I want you to think about, when we come back, let's talk about that from a state of mind. How can a corrections officer just shift gears? Today, right. I'm dealing with someone that's on the Homeland Security top 10 list, right, and then tomorrow I'm dealing with a guy who is accused of stealing a taxi cab.
How do you make that like transition?
Absolutely, yeah. So we'll come back. We'll talk about that. This is a Just Cause Coast to Coast, where we bring you education, awareness, and information about judicial injustice. Before the break, I posed a question to you regarding the facility at Florence, Colorado, where the IRP-6 are currently incarcerated, and wrongly so, I might add, for over 2 years. But on that compound, you have the maximum security, medium security, supermax, and then the prison camp. They rotate the corrections officers from one facility to the other. And like Cliff was saying before the break, how can a corrections officer make that psychological shift where today I might be working over at supermax, tomorrow I might be at max, Then the next week I might be back at Supermax, and then all of a sudden I'm over at the camp. That has to be a strain and a stress on a corrections officer.
Well, it is a strain and a stress, and the way a prison trains its officers really shows a lot about how the prison is. I would hope, I'm not in Colorado, but I would hope that they train their officers constantly and say, okay, if we're going to rotate you, you're in Supermax, you have this set of rules you go by, but when you go to the work camp or the camp where you're in with people that are for possession of marijuana, have not harmed anyone, you need to learn how to adjust yourself to get the mode down to the level of the camp, because these guys are not violent offenders, they're not violent criminals, and it all goes back to the training of the facility. So I would hope that the facility is training their officers properly and giving them stress classes and an avenue of training that can help them cope with the move each month or week or whatever their rotation is.
And what we saw, we've been going there, like Sam said, for about 2 years now. What we saw that the camp administrator, what was his name? Something Griggs.
Griggs.
Yeah. The camp administrator was if there was a guilty party, like you said,
he was the perpetrator.
Yeah, he was the perpetrator of the way that the camp inmates were treated. Because just like you said, in the situation where you were saying, the two captains were a part of the corruption, the administrator Griggs, he would come into the visitation center. Now you have one visitation center that's over at Supermax, and the other portion
of the maximum security.
Yeah, maximum security. Yeah. But then when you're at the camp, this is more of an open environment. You have kids, they're out there, they're playing together. Families can sit together. The inmates can have five visitors at a time. And the camp administrator Griggs comes into the visitation room, and he screams out in front of kids, everybody, this is not a social hour. Sit down. And everybody's looking at him like, first off, who is this man? What is he talking about? And if visitation time for the prisoners is not supposed to be a social hour, then what else is it deemed to be? What are we here for except to socialize with our friends and loved ones that happen to be incarcerated here? And like Sam said, especially when they're falsely convicted and incarcerated and fighting for their life to get out, and then you have the person who's in control that he said, okay, well, this is the way I treat your visitors, your family who's coming, who's supposed to be keeping you of a sound, settled mind. If this is how they're getting treated, then what happens when we as the family members leave? What does what type of perception does that give that to the other corrections officers that, hey, if this is the way that our boss is treating people, he's not going to have any problem with us, harassing them, pushing them around, doing whatever we want to. Sure, we can treat the camp inmates like we do Supermax, and hey, he's the one, he's perpetrating it. Obviously, nothing's going to happen to us.
Well, it sounds like his interpersonal skills are poor. He could. These family members and children are not punished. They're not sentenced to prison, and they're innocent people coming to visit their loved ones. And he could walk in there with a friendly attitude, speak politely to everyone, and probably get more cooperation than coming in there yelling. And I agree with you that his young officers especially, watch their supervisors. And if they're watching by the way he acts, you're absolutely correct. They're going to think this is the way we do it. So now your young officers with 1 or 2 years are going to mold into him, and we just keep getting the same situation over and over. And that's why our prison system needs to watch very closely who they promote, train and teach interpersonal skills, and teach people skills, how to treat people.
That's right, because And by the way, this administrator Griggs, he's gone now, and we as a Just Cause put in several petitions to help him toward his early retirement.
That was polite. Petitions, complaint letters.
If gone, then apparently someone higher than him did believe what you said was going on and took some action, which that makes me happy.
Right, yeah, because I mean we sent letter after letter with affidavits saying this is what we saw him do, this is what went on, and to lay out even more about some of the things he was doing, Gary Walker, which is one of the IRP.
Oh yeah.
He wears prescription glasses, and he's basically legally blind without them. Well, when they transferred him to the federal facility, they took his prescription lenses and said basically he had to apply for them there, and to get them to be able to see. I still don't understand. I mean, he had them when he was basically in holding up in Denver. When they sent him to Florence, they're like, well, we're taking your glasses. You're going to have to apply for them. His wife tried to send him in, like, well, here's his prescription glasses. Check them. I mean, there's not much you can put on prescription lenses. It's like, check them for whatever contraband you think they may have. Soak them in whatever. Soak them in bleach, and then just give them to him so he can see. And this camp administrator, Griggs, he also wore glasses, but and for what was it, three months almost that Gary did not have his glasses. And when he went to Griggs saying, hey, can I get some assistance on my glasses, Griggs, instead of being empathetic to a situation, seeing that he wears glasses as well, reprimanded him, saying, why do you keep coming to me about these glasses? Why don't you leave me alone? It'll happen. When it happens, like, Gary replies, well, I can't see without them. That's why I keep coming to you. I'm legally blind. I can't see without my glasses. So when you have this type of person, like you say, that's at the helm of the ship per se, and then you have the younger officers. They're looking at him saying, well, this must be the way that we need to treat these inmates to keep them in control, instead of, just like your example, if you come in, if you treat their families nice. I mean, these men, their whole existence is off of respect from my fellow man. I got to be in these close quarters with the next person. It's all about respect. So if you come in, if you respect my family, you give me more than anything else that I can ask for. That when my family comes in, like you say, Gary, they're not the ones who are locked up. They're not the ones who who may have for the guys who did commit the crimes. Their families aren't the ones who committed the crime. Treat them with respect, and you can get more respect from a man that way than anything else, I believe.
Right. If you treat the inmate respectfully in front of his family also, and the family respectfully, when you go back on the compound after visitation, I bet you ask the inmate, hey, we got to mop up this dorm tonight. I need some help. I bet you they're going to grab a mop and be glad to help.
That's right. Gary, can you hang around with us for a little bit longer?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, we're going to bring into the conversation Mr. George Mallinckrodt. And, George, if I'm messing up your last name, let me know. But George is a psychotherapist, and he works in the corrections with corrections officers and works with inmates as well. And so, but Gary, when we come back, there are a couple of questions I want to ask you about your book, but then you're more than welcome to chime in on the conversation with George as well. George, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's good to be on.
And so I don't know if you were listening in earlier or not, but, Gary York is a former corrections officer, a probation officer, and then he also has done inspections and basically like internal affairs within prisons as well. And Gary was sharing with us a story that he investigated at one point that involved corrections officers beating, stripping, force-feeding an inmate, and that inmate ended up dying as a result of that. It became an investigation. There was an indictment and so forth and so on. Now, from a psychotherapist perspective, do you hear of this type of thing? Do inmates come to you and say, this is happening, or is your experience totally different from the standpoint of you're dealing with the mentally ill and their circumstances are totally different and they should be handled in a different manner? What's your experience?
Well, let me clarify a little bit. I worked in what's called the Transitional Care Unit. That's a psychiatric ward located within a correctional institute. Now, the unit is self-contained, and so my job there was to counsel inmates in individual and group settings. And so what inmates came to me with were allegations of abuse, and the one that really stood out very starkly was the beating of inmate Joseph Swilling. He was taken to a hallway where there were no cameras, cuffed behind his back, thrown to the floor, and then kicked repeatedly. My coworker at the time came from another angle and had an eyewitness view of the whole thing.
So, Gary, when you hear of something like that, I know it just sends chills up your spine to think that corrections officers would be involved in anything like that.
Well, what he just described, unfortunately, I did internal affairs for 12 years. Myself and my coworkers in the inspector's office, we've investigated crimes similar to that, and I heard him say they took him to an area where there's no camera, and that's one of the typical things that they'll do. They definitely know where all the cameras are, and when they're ready to beat an inmate, the corrupt officers will take the inmate to an area where there's no camera so it can't be videotaped.
So, George, what kind of lasting impact does that have on an inmate? What
had happened there was my coworker was so intimidated by the security guards or the correctional officers that on the incident report, she said she didn't see anything. And when I interviewed the inmate, he knew full well who it was that saw him getting beaten because she banged on the window. She said, "Stop, stop, stop." And so in my incident report, I asked him, "Do you know who it was?" And he said, "No, we've got to protect her." So these inmates had our backs. They knew that these correctional officers were out of control.
So, there's a story that was in the news recently about Darren Rainey. And Mr. Rainey, I think this is the situation, Cliff, where he was in the shower and was scalded and died in the shower.
Yeah, I mean, there was this a shower that the correctional officers modified so that they could control the temperature of the water going in from the outside of the shower. And, it's a closet-sized shower. It's in the transitional control unit. And they put Mr. Rainey in there, and they said the other inmates that were there that were witnesses to it said that he screamed for 2 hours for them to please stop. They said the temperatures were in excess of 180 degrees. When they pulled him out, they took him to the infirmary. He was already deceased. They said that in the infirmary they could not even the thermometers that they had there would not even register his body temperature.
Wow.
It was so high. And then the other inmate who is who pretty much is a witness that, and I mean this happened in 2012, and this inmate who's the witness to this, who has been reaching out to the Florida DOC, reaching out to Dade County Corrections, just to everybody saying, hey, I know that what happened here, this was not an accident. This is a homicide. I have evidence. He was the one who they called in and had him clean it up, and he said when he went in there, he cleaned up chunk of skin that had come off Mr. Rainey's body. When he finished cleaning up the shower, he said they had him take the skin and stuff it into Mr. Rainey's shoes. And then after they had him finish with the shower, they took him to the stairwell where they took Rainey down, had him basically collect chunks of skin that had basically fallen off his body while they had taken him through the stairwell. And he, for 2 years, tried to say, hey, this was not an accident. This man was murdered. This is a homicide. And, when we come back, we can get into all the legal aspects of it, because they for 2 years, they have not been doing anything with this. And just last week, because the ACLU sent a letter and is crying out to everybody, they finally sent a letter to our friend Eric Holder, and I say our friend sarcastically because he does not respond or has not to us. They're trying to get some justice for Darren Rainey, died 2 years ago, basically boiled to death while the correction officers sat back and watched.
So, as Cliff said, we need to take a quick break. Joining us this evening, Mr. Gary York and also Mr. George Mallinckrodt. Gentlemen, when we come back, I want you to think about this question. What rights do inmates have in situations like this? What recourse do they have? And, in Mr. Rainey's case, he died. But let's say you don't die and you're getting subjected to this. Who can you go to with any reasonable expectation that someone is going to take you seriously and do something about it? Who can inmates go to? Think about that. We'll come back on the other side of the break This is a Just Cause Coast to Coast, where we bring you education, awareness, and information about judicial injustice. I'm Sam Thurman, along with Cliff Stewart. Prior to the break, we were talking about the abuse that has been experienced by inmates within the corrections system. We talked about Mr. Darren Rainey and how he died at the hands of corrections officers in a shower. He was scalded to death. George, you brought up a story about Joseph Swilling, and then also, Gary, you shared a story earlier about an inmate being beaten, stripped, and forced, food thrown on the floor, and he was forced to eat it, and then he died. And the question before the break was, assuming that an inmate is subjected to, this violence, number one, is totally uncalled for. I mean, it really makes you sick to your stomach, but
absolutely,
what rights do inmates have? I mean, in that environment, and using the terms that you brought up, Gary, you're subjected to this third society, people who are part of this third society, and who can you trust? Who can you go to say, hey, something is wrong here, these guys are abusing me? So first, Gary, if you can answer that, and then George, if you can come behind that, and then we have a caller that wants to make a comment as well. So, Gary.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, as you know, I worked for the Inspector General's office for 12 years here in Florida, and it is tough for an inmate, especially when he knows that some of the supervisors are backing the corruption and the abuse. So what would happen many times in my case, an inmate would go, and I hate to keep using the word honest officers versus corrupt officers, but the inmate would go to an honest officer that they knew was honest and tell them what happened, and I would sometimes get a call at my office, or maybe when I was at the prison investigating a crime, the officer would walk up to me and say, look, I don't want my name involved because then I'll be on the list of the captains and I'll lose my job, but this is what happened, such, and I would open a case file based on that information. But if the inmate does not have an officer that he can trust or go to, or he's just too scared to tell anybody on the inside for fear of retaliation, somehow during visitation or whatever, the family members need to be told to get a hold. In Florida, the Inspector General's office, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, who are the police of the police, the Governor's Inspector General, state representatives, and if they're not happy with getting the allegation reported to them that something's wrong, because these agencies are for the people, of the people, and for the people, then they're supposed to go check into these allegations to see if they're true and investigate. But I would say that the family needs to get it out there to these different agencies.
George, and what would be your comment to that?
Well, in a unit that was as small as ours and having so many abusive officers, it's really difficult for these guys to make their complaints known because, frankly, they would fill out a grievance, and it was worth as much as toilet paper, honestly. I never saw many grievances addressed properly. The officers in the unit would often read the grievances, come back to the inmate and taunt him, and an inmate has family on the outside. He's got a chance of being heard. If an inmate doesn't have much family or any, he suffers. There's no way for him to get information out there. And in the story that Julie Brown broke for the Herald, she got information from an inmate named Harold Hempstead, who I got to know a little bit when I was there. He persisted from the inside as well as Joyner in trying to get some attention to Darren Rainey. And the odd thing is I was on the outside doing the same thing. So we were both working without each other knowing that we were trying to get justice for Darren Rainey.
And, that's why it's so important, and like Cliff, you were sharing, even in dealing with Griggs, the administrator at Florence, organizations like A Just Cause and other advocacy groups getting involved. And, so I would say, adding to the list that George, you mentioned, as well as you, Gary, that, folks have advocacy groups that they can reach out to. And it's a shame that a lot of times people turn a deaf ear to this kind of thing, but and they seem to approach it from the standpoint, well, it's not happening to me. It hasn't happened to anyone in my family, so it can't really be that bad. But it really is that bad, and so people need to get involved and help out where they can when it comes to this kind of thing. I think we have a caller, Cliff.
Yes, we have a caller on the line. Lawana, thank you for calling. You have a comment or a question?
Yes, thank you for letting me speak. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was sitting here listening to the guest talking about what happened to this man, and I cannot explain the sadness, the anguish I feel that this could happen in the United States of America. While they point their fingers at all these other countries, and a man is screaming for his life for 2 hours, and they have the power to turn some water up that hot and scald somebody. I couldn't do that to my worst enemy. Something has got to be done about this, the cruelty that goes on in these prisons, and I guarantee you, we haven't even heard the worst of what they do to these men. They treat them like dogs, they treat them worse than animals. And I don't care what a human being did, they're in there to pay their dues, but you have no right, I don't care what they did, to misuse and abuse a human being. They are human beings. I don't care what they did. That's why they went to prison. It's even worse if they're in there abused, and I don't care what they did, they should never be treated as such. This makes me sick to my stomach. I can't believe that this is happening. And I'm going to pray until God does something to stop this to human beings. And in the United States of America, this is ridiculous. It shouldn't happen in any land, but here even more so. And then these people, you know why they do it? They get away with it because nothing is done about it. And then even if you're in a higher position, if you even hear of such, that should be dealt with immediately. I mean, immediately. They say this is happening. They say that's happening. Then dig into it. This is horrible. You don't just let this go. As long as people don't say nothing, it goes on and on. It gets worse and worse and worse. I think it is.
I totally agree.
I have no words. I just can't believe it. Thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you for your comments. And
I agree with the caller.
I mean, absolutely. Somebody needs to be held accountable. And before, I just wanted to make a quick point. She's saying that no matter what a person has done, no matter what crime or whatever, and I totally agree with her. They're there. The fact that they're in prison, that they're pulled away from society, from their family, from their freedom, that is their payment. That is their punishment for their crime. You have this in a transition unit. Mr. Rainey is a mentally ill person that should be in a hospital in the first place, not in a corrections facility. And then this is done to him as a mentally ill patient that never should be there in the first place. And George, I read part of your blog, and you made a comment that said instead of funding mentally health facilities, we close them down and leave the desperate to fend for themselves. Where do they end up? In prison. Our prisons have become repositories for the mentally ill, where they are treated no better than they were in the Middle Ages, beaten, tortured, and killed. And it speaks to be true when you look at this case of Mr. Rainey, to be boiled to death in a closet with the water on, boiling as hot as they want it to be. How do they even get that type of power inside of a prison as a guard?
Yeah, I think that some of these guards that they hire, their moral compass is just all over the place. They're easily sucked into a culture of abuse. Whenever the powerful have power over the powerless, they abuse it.
Well, I agree with that, and I just want to jump in real quick and say one thing. I don't know how they do in other states, but in Florida, they don't give polygraph examinations or psychological exams before hiring like a lot of other agencies do. And not that will weed out every bad apple, but that will weed out a lot of them, and they don't do it because they say they don't have the funds. Don't you think if they would pay for psychological exams, polygraph tests, that in the long run you would save some money somewhere on investigations and abuse? I think you would. That's just my opinion.
And that would definitely help. The other thing is the guards that were in this psychiatric unit had no training with how to deal with the mentally ill. Right. They were ill-prepared.
They don't get trained in that area. You're right.
Yeah. And so these abuses happen, was said earlier in the show, when they have some issue that they just want to perpetuate on the inmate and create a situation where they're getting off on somebody else's suffering, which is just unimaginable, but it's happening.
Yep.
Yeah. What happens is we end up with without the proper screening, without the proper background check of these law enforcement officers, these prison guards, this third society who's supposed to take care, custody, and control of the inmates. You end up basically with psychopaths in there who are getting off on the pain, the suffering, the torture of other human beings.
Exactly.
And they use it as their playground to say, if I was on the outside, I would be prosecuted for this. Someone in law enforcement, or someone would open up an investigation with law enforcement, but I can get a job inside the system, find a corner where no camera is catching my actions, and I can take out my cruelest intentions on another human being and never be held accountable for it.
It's crazy.
Well, let me tell you, I've investigated correctional officers who put scanners in their personal vehicles and blue lights. Now, they are not law enforcement. They're correctional officers. But when they're off duty, they're out there playing law enforcement. So what does that tell you? What kind of mentality? That's a power-hungry human being right there.
Yes.
Can you say George Zimmerman?
George Zimmerman.
Yes.
It's the Zimmerman psyche. And, Gary, as I look at the fact that you have 2 books that you've written, and you must have had. Well, first, what is your current status as far as in the corrections? Are you still active, or
I'm working in a courthouse in Florida. I work in a courthouse. Yeah.
And I was just going to say, it looks here, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you wrote 2 books within a 6-month period. You had a lot of stuff.
Well, it took longer than that 6 months. They just ended up getting published 6 months apart, but it took about 2.5 years for me to write them. But each book contains many more stories than just the one I described to you. It contains stories of the head man of the Florida Department of Corrections who went to prison for 8 years, and it contains some wardens who were corrupt and covering up things that were going on in the prison, which falls back on what we're talking about today. So there's a lot of stories in those books that fall into the category of our discussions today. We just don't have time for me to tell you all of them, So
right. And so when people read Corruption Behind Bars as well as Inside the Inner Circle, that's the flavor of what they can expect in reading those is some expose, so to speak, of
Correct.
Some of the concepts we're talking about.
Corruption Behind Bars are all stories that I investigated myself in the prison system, where the corruption ran all the way from corrupt officers at the bottom of the chain all the way to the head man of the Florida Department of Corrections, who ended up with 8 years federal prison, and 90 more of his supervisors were terminated from their positions based on embezzlement, corruption, cover-ups, kickbacks, and all types of things.
Wow. So, George, the ACLU wrote a letter to the Department of Justice, and Cliff was talking about it earlier, wrote a letter to Attorney General Eric Holder regarding Mr. Rainey's death. And in their letter, they say that Mr. Rainey's death is one of 7 in the state of Florida. And I'm sure, Gary, you could probably chime in on this as well. But it's one of 7 deaths in the prisons under scrutiny. The letter talks about deliberate avoidance of investigations. It's like, not releasing autopsy reports in the Rainey situation. His family still has not received an autopsy report. There were delays in calling for paramedics. And, when you hear of something like this, especially in dealing with the mentally ill. It's like they're already at a disadvantage, and then something like this happens. It impacts the families. Do you have any interaction with the families, George, after something like this happened?
No, I didn't have any interaction immediately after Darren Rainey's death, but I share the frustration in trying to get things done. After his death, I spoke to an assistant U.S. attorney in a local Department of Justice branch here in Miami, and she put me with FBI agents who interviewed me, and nothing came of that. I would have thought that somebody being scalded to death by guards would be enough to open a case. From there, I called the ME's office about a dozen times to find out if the report had been done. I left half a dozen calls with the Miami police and the detective that was finally on the case. I even sent an email to a Herald reporter a couple months and after Rainey had been killed and got nothing back. And so this is just, it's incredible that this is happening. But to answer your question about family, I have spoken to Darren Rainey's brother, Andre. What was immediately apparent when I spoke to him was his anguish over this case, which had been basically closed by the DOC, and then they're basically saying, okay, we're going to reopen it now. He wants to know what's going on, and he deserves to know what's going on.
Absolutely, and I look at the article that was written in the Herald by Julie Brown. When, she said the Miami-Dade medical examiner, this Bruce Heimer, he's not even releasing the autopsy because what he's saying, he needs the results of the police investigation in order to interpret his findings. Since when does a medical examiner use anybody else's information to interpret their finding of how a human died? I don't need I don't need law enforcement's interpretation. Like, okay, did you guys shoot this guy? Because what I'm seeing is you boiled him. So if that is what your medical examination lays out, you don't need their interpretation of what happened to give your findings. I mean, the warden at Dade County, where Mr. Rainey was held, says that the prison system has no tolerance for inmate abuse and has a strong track record of taking immediate, decisive action. And this is what really threw me and just made my blood boil. When law enforcement provides them with evidence of criminal wrongdoing. Well, if you hide the evidence for 2 years, I mean, even the 911 recording wasn't even saved by Dade County PD in this situation. And it's been 2 years later. They just opened the case in May because Ms. Brown pushed so much in the media, like, what happened to this man? You guys kill him, and then you don't even open an investigation saying, well, we don't know why he died. And the medical examiner?
Wow. George and Gary.
It's been a pass the buck mentality here. The medical examiner is saying, well, we have to wait for the detectives for determination. Then the detectives are turning around and saying, well, we're waiting for the medical examiner to wrap it up. So it's unbelievable.
Charlotte Correctional Institution in Punta Gorda, Florida, is having an investigation right now. They just had another inmate beating death, and that's going on right now also.
Wow.
Yeah, that was Damian Foster, and coincidentally, I got to know him also. He was at Dade CI when I was there.
Well, he's one of the two. Charlotte's got two going, and also Walker. Walker was handcuffed for not cooperating with orders and beaten and died, beaten while he was handcuffed and died. And NBC2 out of Fort Myers interviewed me because it's so similar to the Edwards death that I described earlier.
Right.
George and Gary, if you guys can oblige us and just hang in there just a few more minutes, and you have been more than gracious to stick with us a little bit longer than what you had said your availability was. Let us take this quick break, and then we're going to come back and let's pose another question to you. How do we fix this mess? And so, both of you, think about that. And because obviously both of you have a lot of information available to you, but we need to talk just a moment about how do we fix this mess, not just in Florida, but across the country, because It is a big mess that we're in, and and we get tired of hearing that we got the greatest justice system in the world, but then when you hear stories like this, it's a problem. This is a Just Cause Coast to Coast, where we bring you education, awareness, and information about judicial injustice. I'm Sam Thurman, along with Cliff Stewart. A Just Cause Coast to Coast, where we bring you education, awareness, and information about judicial injustice. I'm Sam Thurman with Cliff Stewart. Joining us are George Mallinckrodt and Gary York. And we've been talking about prisoners' rights and the abuse that occurs in prisons. And both George and Gary have some shocking firsthand accounts of some of the things that can go on behind bars. And, we posed a question just before the break as to what do we need to do to fix this? How do we fix it? And, George, before you answer this question, I want to preface it with the fact that, in your recent interview with the Miami-Dade Herald, that you were interviewed by the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office. But then it says that about the Rainey case, but it says that, you said that, but you're not really hopeful that criminal charges are forthcoming. And, that is, when you look at the fact that the offices that you think should be accountable for investigations and looking into these matters, but then, in your situation, George, even to the extent that, you have taken on an advocacy role, I would say, in these types of matters, and then you end up losing your job over it, and so, I mean, one person is quoted in the paper saying that they thought you were set up. But, back to the point as far as, how do we fix it? When the folks who are supposed to look into it, you don't even have the confidence level that they're going to bring any charges.
That's exactly right, and some of my pessimism stems from my own efforts to try to bring light to this situation. And in fact, about a month before Julie Brown broke her story, I sent a complaint to the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. I haven't heard back. No big surprise there. As far as trying to fix the system, I don't think necessarily that the training programs and these sorts of things will actually work. And I am coming from a pessimistic point of view because I know that situations exist, as in the Stanford prison experiment study, where they got 24 subjects that were middle-class white guys, and they divided them in half. Half were inmates, half were guards, and within 3 days, the guards were abusing the inmates. So
wow.
I see it, and it's a well-known study. And so based on that and the fact that I just think the powerful abuse the powerless, we've got to have, in my opinion, a completely separate agency that maintains and installs high-definition cameras throughout the prison, no blind spots. They also collect and disseminate all inmate grievances, and if there is found to be some sort of abuse or something, horrible, they have the power to investigate and make arrests. And they have to be separate from the DOC, because I don't trust the DOC to regulate themselves.
Absolutely. Nor DOJ.
Well, so
yeah.
Gary, what do you think? What are some ideas?
I've already told you about the psychological exams and polygraphs. I do believe that will get some of them. It won't get all of them, but I think it will help. But there's one thing that has to be done so that the other officers see it. If you're honest, it's not going to change the way you work. You're an honest officer. But if you're even thinking about doing any of these things, we can't wait around to take action. Swift action against wrongdoers. Swift termination from the job, swift action to pull their certification so they can't be allowed back in the prison system to continue this type of action. And if criminal charges, let's do it swiftly. Let's don't wait around a year or two. Let's do it quickly before people forget about it. And if we take quick action and swift action and hard action, the other officers are going to see this and say, I don't want to go to prison for doing this type of stuff,
I agree with you, Gary.
And
it's taken too long to take care of the problem. It just needs to be swift.
And there also needs to be more done than just a lip service. The POGO, the Project on Government Oversight, did a study recently, and they published it in March, and it was talking about even just the corruption among prosecutors. And so, it's across the board, and there needs to be reform across the board. and there needs to be transparency. I know there's a push within Congress to pass a law to where there are inspector general's offices that are set up to have oversight, and it goes right along with what you were talking about, George, with regard to independent organizations. Now, and I think we have to be careful on that from the standpoint of we already have the prison industrial complex, and so, some areas and some states and some municipalities have situations where, the privatized prison systems are holding the gun to the government's head, saying that we don't have enough prisoners, so you need to convict more people. So I know that that's not what you're talking about, Gary, but I mean, George,
right. I understand. No, I understand. Yeah, the private prisons, they still have the Inspector General's office going out there doing their investigations, but they only are investigating what is told to the inspector's office by the private prison itself,
right.
So they can also tell us only what they want us to know.
Yeah, and then you have, I think what is really atrocious, and I don't know, how much, Gary, that you experienced it in your career as an inspector, but a lot of times, like the IRP-6, they'll tell us, well, they know that an inspector is coming in a week and a half.
Oh, they clean it up.
So they clean up the whole compound. Everybody.
That happens all the time.
Yeah, it's like what? How does anything ever get? How does any issue ever get addressed when you say the inspector's coming? So now, don't abuse anybody this week. Threaten every inmate that if you say something about the abuse while the inspector is here, we're going to get you as soon as he leaves. Everybody, we're gonna let you wash your clothes. We're gonna let everybody take their showers that morning. We're gonna give you all your rights the day that the inspector gets here, and then basically threaten you with, harm or death even if you bring up these issues. Like you say, there's gotta be some third party, like you say, George, that can be called upon, that these issues can be dealt with, and especially with the inmates who don't have family members that they can reach out to. There's got to be somebody that's outside the system that oversees the system that says we're not going to allow you to mistreat humans. And my comment earlier about DOJ basically watching themselves and being accountable to themselves. We find the same thing in the federal prisons, that they're informed when the inspectors are going to come. And then, George, like you reached out to AG Eric Holder, no response after a month. We have been calling, writing, faxing, emailing his office for 2 years now with evidence in hand saying, hey, just look at this. Open an investigation. We're telling you what's going on. We're not asking you to even go find anything. Just make a phone call and say, hey, this is what some citizens or advocacy group has told me. Give me any information that you have about it. That is not difficult. That is a 30-second call, and he doesn't even have to make it himself, Eric Holder. He can get one of his employees, cohorts, whatever you want to call them, and say, call them on my behalf, ask them about this case, and tell them I want to see everything on it on my desk by morning. That is very simple, and I guarantee you'll get answers if the scrutiny starts to come up from that high.
Right.
So,
yeah.
George,
and I'll tell you one thing. You're right in what you're saying. I was a little different, I believe, in those 12 years, and I think there's people out there that are retired or still working that will tell you. I would show up at Dade Correctional, Everglades, Central Florida prisons, midnight, 1 in the morning, 4 a.m., unannounced. And why did I do that? Because I knew if I announced that I was headed over there, I would not see what I was trying to see. And by going there unannounced, I was able to uncover a lot of things and get a lot of corrupt folks out of there, but I couldn't do it by myself. And not everybody's going to get out of bed and do that type of thing, show up unannounced at 1 in the morning,
And Gary, you just answered one of the questions that I had, because and to me it sounds like your military experience is kind of kicking in there, because I was in the Air Force and I was part of the IG team in the Air Force, but
I understand where we're coming from.
So the unannounced is going to tell you the true story. And so that I had just written down, what about unannounced inspections? And so, Gary, and then also, just to compliment you And there's a phrase that we use here on the show, and it says, we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so we know that there are good, and in the term that you use, honest officers. We know that there are a lot of good people that are in law enforcement. We know that there are a lot of good corrections officers. We know that there are a lot of people, even as far as good prosecutors. I mean, if a person does a crime, then, and they legitimately did it, and I don't know if you can legitimately do a crime, but if they, did the crime, they need to do the time. And, there are people who take their job seriously. And so we're not talking about the honest officers of the court, honest corrections officers, honest law enforcement officers. But like you said, Gary, we got to weed out the bad apples. And so hats off to you as far as, making those types of sacrifices and doing what you need to do to expose the corruption that's in the system. So, Gary, go ahead.
I just want to tell you, and I know that that's the way you feel, and that's why I'm glad to be on your show, because I know you're not talking about anybody but the corrupt officials. And I'd like to just make one quote. I just want to say the third society, as I call them, the corrupt officials, they hate the truth, and they hate those of us who speak the truth.
And we believe that. We believe that wholeheartedly. And so, Gary, let's give you a quick plug, and then we're going to let you guys go. We got to kind of start to wrap things up here in a moment ourselves. So, Gary York is a former corrections officer, former probation officer, and has many years of experience in behind the scenes. Has 2 books out. One is entitled Corruption Behind Bars. The other is Inside the Inner Circle. And Gary is talking about, the third society, those corrupt officers that are out there. There's a lot of firsthand account stuff that Gary can share with you. And so, Gary, we appreciate it. How can folks get in contact with you, Gary, if they want to reach out to you, if they want to just find out how to get your book?
Well, my book is on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and also on my website, corruptionbehindbars.com. If they want to follow me on Twitter, it's at Gary York 4 on Twitter, and I put some things out every now and then to try to help educate and inform.
Okay. And so, go ahead, Cliff.
No, I was just going to, for George, in your closing thoughts, just to pose, one last question to you. You speak about how there's been no funding for the mental institutions at the state level. They're being shut down, and the mentally ill are being shuffled and, basically just carted into prisons. Where's the legislature that says, we need funding for the mental institutions, for those who are basically being thrown out on the street, and then on just any small charge, trespassing, loitering, you broke a window, you filled a cup of Coke on the street, they end up in a jail cell. They end up in these transition units, and then, like Darren Rainey, they end up being murdered by the corrupt prison staff. What do we do about getting the mentally ill the help that they need?
Well, the obvious answer is to open more community mental health facilities. That would go a long way. But one of the conversations that I had with my coworkers, more or less on a constant basis, was we would look at an inmate who was obviously chronically mentally ill, and we'd scratch our heads and we'd say, how did they ever find this guy fit for trial?
Right.
And it's happening all the time, and there's no other place for them to go. So the percentage of the chronically mentally ill in prison is rising. It's not falling, it's rising. I'd like to make one quick point, though, about private contractors that supply, in my case, mental health and medical staff to the transitional care unit. That contractor, Horizon Health, did not have any trainings for staff on what to do when they saw abuse to report it. There was nothing in our employee manual about reporting abuse. They need to be held accountable. They need to step up to the plate and take a stand against abuse.
That's absolutely right. That's like having police officers that you don't train them to fight crime. How do you call them? You call them a police officer.
Right. And these private companies, it's they get these multi-million-dollar contracts that we pay with our taxpayer money, and they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them.
That's it.
Well, George, Gary, again, we want to thank you for joining us, and you guys have been more than gracious again. You spent quite a bit of time with us this evening, but you have enlightened us to some of the things that can happen behind the scenes. Gary York, again, author of Corruption Behind Bars and Inside the Inner Circle. You can find information regarding Gary York on ajcradio.com. Again, ajcradio.com, and look at the archives for tonight's program. And then also George Mallinckrodt is a psychotherapist that has worked in the corrections, in the transitional care unit for the state prisons in Florida, and has direct knowledge of the terrible story of Mr. Rainey, and the one that we were sharing earlier, where he was scalded in the shower, and then also other stories. I mean, they're just, when you listen to it, and like, I don't know if it was Gary or George had mentioned that there are stories out there that they're happening, they're in the news. They were sharing one just a moment ago that's occurring in the Charlotte corrections facility down there in Florida. And, you know, this kind of thing is happening, but no one ever hears about it.
Yes, that's the problem.
That's the problem. And
that's why I wrote my book.
Yeah. And it's like people need to, understand that this stuff is going on, and we need a grassroots movement for people to get involved and say, we're not going to take this kind of stuff. You know, like you were saying, I think the caller, Lawana, was saying about if someone is in prison, you may be classified as an inmate, but that does not mean that you are a dog. You're not an animal. You are not. You should not be treated with inhumane actions. That's just that should not be happening. Right, and so, also, Cliff, if you can give that plug right there. Please.
Yeah, we for George, we appreciate you coming on the show as well. You're the author of a soon-to-be-published book entitled "Getting Away with Murder."
Yes.
Real quick, we're down to the wire in about 30 seconds. Give us information about that, when it should be released, and where it can be purchased.
I'm estimating August 1st for it to be released. I'm going to self-publish. It'll be available on my website, georgemallinckrodt.com, and it's a very multifaceted book, and at the core of it is my friendship with my coworker. So we explore this crazy situation together.
Excellent.
Okay,
go, George.
Gary York, George Mallinckrodt, thank you for joining us this evening on A Just Cause Coast to Coast.